At 6:40 on our last morning in the Kuskokwim drainage, Dario opened the cook tent and said very quietly, "There's a track next to the truck." Not tracks, not a trail. One impression in the frost pressed into the ground 8 inches from the driver's door of our F350. It was 63 centimeters long, 46 wide, and clean at the edges, as if whatever made it had not walked there, but simply stood there. There was no second print, no broken brush, no approach path, no sound during the night, even though our tents were 30 meters away. For 25 nights we had slept in that clearing, believing the wilderness around us still followed rules we understood: wind, permafrost, animal movement, weather. But by that morning, the trees had already leaned toward places they should not lean. A basin of dead spruce had gone silent. Fog had moved against the wind, and now something had stood beside the one vehicle we needed to leave. A wildlife biologist later told us he had no identification for the print. An elder from the region gave me an explanation I still wish I had never heard. He said it had not been threatening us. He said it was checking on us. This is what happened before that final morning. My name is Renata Voss. I was a field geologist for 9 years, the last 4 of those with a small private contracting firm out of Fairbanks that did site assessment work for mining permit applications, pipeline routing studies, and the occasional federal land survey. The work was not glamorous. It was mostly logistics, moving equipment over bad roads, collecting core samples, filing reports that would be read by 3 people in offices I never visited. I was good at it. I liked the routine of it. I liked that the wilderness, as frightening as it could be in practical terms, operated by rules I had spent years learning to read. The land made sense to me when most other things didn't, and that is not a small thing to say about a place. I am telling you what happened in September of 2 years ago because I have now accepted that I am not going to stop thinking about it, and the only thing I have not tried is saying it plainly, in full, in order, the way I would file a report. I have talked to the other 2 people who were there. We have compared notes more times than was probably healthy for any of us. What I am going to tell you is not a story we assembled together into something coherent after the fact. It is what happened, as precisely as I can account for it, with the acknowledgement that there are portions I cannot explain and have stopped trying to. We were 3 weeks into a 5-week assignment in the Kuskokwim drainage, a region of interior Alaska that I will not locate more precisely than that for reasons that will become clear. The project was a preliminary assessment for a mineral exploration permit, copper and cobalt, primarily covering roughly 400 square miles of mixed boreal and wetland terrain. The landscape up there in early September is extraordinary and hostile in equal measure. The birches had already started turning, that particular hard yellow that looks almost metallic in the low-angle morning light, the color of something being warned rather than something simply changing. The ground was soft almost everywhere and frozen in the depressions, so your footing changed character every few yards in a way that required constant low-level attention you couldn't afford to stop paying. The black spruce stands that dominated the wetter ground were the tight, slow-growing trees you found everywhere in that part of the interior. 15 to 20 feet tall at most, sometimes shorter, their canopies thin and asymmetric, their trunks often twisted at the base by decades of freeze-thaw movement in the active layer above the permafrost. They grew in congregations so dense that moving through them required you to turn sideways and push, and they smelled, especially in the mornings, like cold resin and something darker underneath, something that had been composting in the wet ground for longer than the trees themselves had been standing. The days were shortening fast. By the time we arrived in late August, we had maybe 14 hours of usable light, and by the time we left in late September, it was closer to 11, and the quality of the light was changing daily, getting lower in the sky, more oblique, throwing longer shadows earlier in the afternoon, making the landscape feel like it was always approaching dusk, even at midday. That quality of light does something to your spatial perception in open ground. Distances become harder to judge. Things at the edges of your field of vision seem closer and then turn out to be further away. I had worked enough seasons in the interior to know this was a visual artifact of the angle and not a sign of anything wrong. But knowing it didn't prevent the sensation from occurring, and the sensation, repeated dozens of times a day, accumulated in you the way small physical discomforts did. You didn't notice the weight of it until you tried to put it down. The crew was myself, a field technician named Dario Marsh, and a sampling specialist named Claudia Reyes, who went by her last name professionally, and everyone called her Reyes. Dario was 26, meticulous, quiet, and had a gift for reading topographic maps that made him invaluable in complex terrain. He could hold a topo in his head and navigate by it the way some people navigated by landmarks, which was a skill that took most people years to develop, and he seemed to have been born with. Reyes was 38, had done field work on 4 continents, including 2 seasons in the Brooks Range and 1 in the Siberian taiga, and approached every assignment with the specific energy of someone who had already accounted for everything that could go wrong and was mildly bored by the ordinary version of it. She was the most competent field person I had ever worked alongside, which I mean not as flattery, but as a relevant fact about who she was and how she processed what happened to us. She and I had worked together 3 times before. Dario was newer to the company, but had already proven himself the previous summer on a difficult coastal survey involving tidal flat navigation and instrument operation in driving rain. They were both professionals. I want to establish that before anything else, because what I'm going to describe involves all 3 of us arriving at the same conclusion independently. And I think it matters that we were not the kind of people who talked ourselves into things or who filled ambiguity with imagination. Our base was a wall tent camp we'd established in the first week, positioned on a dry bench about 12 miles off the nearest maintained road, accessible by a utility track that the permit application materials described as seasonally passable. That was technically accurate and practically alarming. The track had been cut sometime in the 1980s for an old seismic survey program and had been maintained sporadically since by the Bureau of Land Management, which meant it was drivable in a high-clearance truck with good tires if you accepted that you would lose a day every time the ground thawed wrong beneath it or a section of it slumped into the drainage ditch on the downhill side. We drove it in the modified F35. Oh, the company kept in Fairbanks specifically for assignments like this one. The truck was old enough to have developed character and new enough to remain reliable, which is the only configuration that functions in that environment. The camp was straightforward in the way all well-run field camps were straightforward. 2 sleeping tents on the dry ground of the bench, the larger canvas wall tent for equipment storage and cooking, a composting toilet arrangement in the spruce at the eastern edge of the bench, a Globalstar satellite communicator for daily check-ins with the Fairbanks office, and a generator we ran for 2 hours each evening for charging batteries and running the data laptop. We had bear canisters for all food storage, a bear deterrent system involving perimeter noise triggers, and the standard protocols for wildlife encounter that any experienced field crew carried as reflex by that point in their careers. Bears were a real and continuous consideration in that country. Moose were a real consideration. Everything else that might concern a person in that landscape had a procedure, a protocol, a practiced response. We had the procedures. We followed them. The camp was orderly, and the procedures were sound, and none of them covered what actually happened. The first 2 weeks were unremarkable in every way that mattered to my professional log. We worked a systematic grid across the southern portion of the survey block, collecting soil and rock samples every quarter mile, running magnetometer transects, logging terrain features and drainage patterns, noting vegetation communities and their boundaries. The work was physical and precise and satisfying in the way I'd always found it satisfying, the particular contentment of being a person who knows exactly what she is doing in a place that doesn't care whether she knows or not, the pleasure of competence applied to something genuinely indifferent to it. The weather cooperated more than it had any obligation to in that season and that latitude. We saw moose on 4 separate occasions, a black bear once at significant distance who was not remotely interested in us, and caribou twice. Small groups moving through the open sedge flats in that particular unhurried directional way caribou moved, as if they were following a route they'd memorized in a different century. The nights were cold and got colder by degrees. The aurora appeared on 2 nights in the second week and was the most extraordinary I had seen in 4 years of working in the interior. Curtains of green and white and occasional deep red that moved with a muscular fluidity, filling the entire northern sky from horizon to zenith. And Dario photographed it for 40 minutes one night from the clearing and showed us the images the next morning with a happiness so uncomplicated and complete it was almost touching to witness in a grown man. Nothing wrong happened in those first 2 weeks. I want to be emphatic about that, because when I have told portions of this to people since returning, there is a consistent tendency to want to retrofit the early days with warning signs, with atmospheric precursors, with subtle wrongnesses that foreshadow what came later. There weren't any, or none that I recognized as such. The landscape was precisely what the topo and the literature told me it would be. The trees were trees. The ground was ground. The silence was the silence of a place genuinely far from human habitation, which has a specific quality distinct from urban quiet. Not absence, but a fullness that doesn't include you, a completeness the place achieved long before you arrived and would return to the moment you left. I had worked in wilderness long enough to be comfortable with that feeling. It did not disturb me. The sounds at night were wind in the spruce canopy, occasional small mammals moving in the brush near the camp perimeter, the creak of tent poles in temperature change. I slept without difficulty. We all did. The first thing that didn't make sense happened on the morning of day 16. Dario had been running magnetometer transects along the eastern portion of the survey grid, which took him through a section of dense black spruce on moderately wet ground, the kind of stand where the trees grew in such tight congregation that the interior was a different world from the outside, dim and close and smelling of standing water and the particular compressed sourness of black spruce resin. He came back to camp at the lunch break and was quiet in the way he was sometimes quiet after a hard morning of technical work, focused inward and processing. But at some point, over lunch, he said without particular urgency that there was a section of the spruce stand about 1.5 miles east of camp where the trees were all leaning toward a common center. Not wind lean. He was specific about this distinction, and I understood why he was making it. He knew what wind lean looked like. It was directional, and it was consistent with the prevailing weather patterns, and it produced a specific signature in the branching structure of the trees on the exposed side. These trees were leaning inward from multiple directions toward a point in the center of the stand, like a crowd of people orienting towards something happening in their middle. He estimated the affected area at about 30 yards across. The center of the convergence, he said, was empty. No clearing, no fallen tree that might have created a light gap, no rock formation, no frost heave or collapsed pingo that might have disrupted the root systems differentially. Just the convergence, and beyond it, spruce in normal posture. I thought about it professionally for a moment and suggested a permafrost irregularity, a subsurface ice lens that had expanded unevenly and tilted the root systems toward the depression as it melted, or an old thermokarst feature that had created differential soil moisture and competition for light. Dario said that was probably right. We moved on and talked about the afternoon's work plan, and I logged the feature that evening as a terrain anomaly consistent with permafrost dynamics and noted it for follow-up. Reyes returned from her afternoon sampling run and mentioned, unprompted and without apparent concern, that she had encountered a section of ground about 2 kilometers north of camp, where the tussock grass and sedge had died back in a pattern she couldn't attribute to any drainage or frost feature she could identify. Not a circle, she was precise about that, because circular dieback had known causes, and she had already eliminated them. This was elongated, narrow at both ends, and broader through the middle, like the footprint of something long and tapered, roughly 60 meters from end to end. The dieback was old enough that the dead material had flattened and begun to compost at the edges. She'd taken photographs and soil samples from 3 points within the zone and planned to note it in the log as a vegetation anomaly of undetermined cause, pending lab analysis. I asked if she'd seen any surface evidence of what might have caused it: equipment, spilled materials, evidence of an old structure. She said nothing. The soil samples she'd collected were unremarkable on visual inspection. She seemed neither alarmed nor particularly curious. Field anomalies turned up constantly in that kind of work, and most of them resolved into ordinary explanations once you had more data and more time. That evening, I mapped both features, Dario's leaning spruce stand and Reyes's dieback zone, on the working topo I kept in the cook tent. They were approximately 1.3 kilometers apart, on a rough north-south line relative to camp. I did not draw any conclusion from their spatial relationship at that point. I noted both in the master field log and went to sleep thinking about the next day's transect logistics. Day 17 was a short operational day. A cold front moved through from the northwest beginning mid-morning, bringing 40-knot gusts and a driving rain that turned to sleet by 2 in the afternoon. We spent the morning securing the camp, restaking fly ropes, weighting the equipment tent's ground sheet, lashing the generator cover against the wind, and the afternoon inside the cook tent, going over data, maintaining equipment, and playing cards with the kind of flat, familiar competitiveness that formed the social texture of small crews in remote camps. Nothing happened that day that I would report, except for one thing that I did not mention to the others at the time. In the brief window before the rain arrived, I walked to the tree line on the southern edge of the clearing to check the guy lines on the equipment tent, which was nearest the spruce. The wind at that point was steady and strong enough to be physically effortful to walk into. The spruce canopy above and behind the tree line was moving visibly, audibly, the way spruce moved in serious wind, a low, continuous, surging sound like water running fast over rock, the upper branches whipping in arcs. But the trees directly at the edge of the clearing, the ones nearest the camp, 12, maybe 15 trees standing in the immediate line of sight from the equipment tent, were perfectly still. Their branches were not moving, their crowns were not swaying. In a wind that was physically moving me as I stood in it, those trees at the clearing's edge were motionless, as if they were behind glass, as if the wind that was happening to everything else was not happening to them. I watched them for 30 seconds, long enough to be certain of what I was seeing, and then the wind shifted slightly and they were moving like everything else. I stood there for another few seconds and then finished checking the guy lines and went back inside. I put it in my personal field log that evening as a wind shadow anomaly, a turbulence effect from the clearing geometry, and I said nothing about it to Dario or Reyes. Day 18. The front had moved through by morning and left the world clean and very cold and shining. We resumed full operations. I ran the western transects, which were mostly open ground, broad, wet meadow, sedge flat, stretching toward a distant line of alder on the western horizon, occasional elevated patches where the ground was dry enough for grass. It was the kind of landscape that was easy to move through and easy to read, and the day was productive in the uncomplicated way good fieldwork days were productive. I collected good samples from the right locations. My magnetometer readings were clean and consistent. I logged terrain features accurately and in good light. I ate lunch sitting on a section of elevated ground with a long view north toward the foothills of the Alaska Range, which were pale blue with distance and already showing snow on their upper slopes, and I felt the clean, particular happiness of someone doing what she was trained to do in a place that rewarded attention. What I want to tell you about day 18 is what Dario found when he returned to the leaning spruce stand to complete the transect coverage he'd deferred. He came back to camp at 3 in the afternoon, 2 hours earlier than his planned return time. He started dinner without saying why he was back early, and he made it with the focused, slightly excessive attention to the process that I had learned to read as Dario's way of organizing himself after something unsettled him. He made dinner for 40 minutes, and we ate, and then he described what he'd found. He had gone to the edge of the leaning spruce stand intending to run his transect lines through the interior. He had stood at the boundary and looked toward the center where the lean converged. The first thing he said he noticed was that the lean was more pronounced than the day before. The second thing, and he was deliberate about the sequence, saying the first thing first, because it was the more explainable of the two, was that the light inside the stand was wrong. He used that word specifically, acknowledging it was imprecise, because he said he couldn't find a more precise word for what he was seeing. The light in the interior of the stand was dimmer than the ambient light falling on the surrounding landscape, not canopy shadow dim, which was the ordinary dimness of standing inside a dense tree stand where the upper branches absorbed the direct light, something different. He said it was the dim of a room with the blinds drawn, a contained dimness, a held-in quality, as if the light inside the stand were under a different rule than the light outside it. He said he stood at the edge for 5 minutes. He did not go in. The reason he didn't go in was not that anything prevented him physically. He said it was the sensation familiar to anyone who has worked in the field long enough to have encountered real hazards of a decision that his body had already made before his mind finished asking the question. The physical stillness that preceded a choice your nervous system had already registered as wrong. He trusted that response, he said, the way he always trusted it, because in his experience, ignoring it never produced a good outcome. He walked the stand's perimeter instead, got what transect data he could from the outside, and came back. Reyes had returned from her own afternoon work and listened to this without expression, the way she listened to everything technical. When Dario finished, she said she had returned to her vegetation dieback zone that afternoon for additional samples, and she had also felt reluctant to enter, though unlike Dario, she had gone in anyway. The dieback was larger than on her first observation, both ends extended, the overall footprint perhaps 20% bigger, though she acknowledged that her initial estimate could have been imprecise. The samples she'd pulled were fine. The ground inside the zone was unremarkable, but she said that 15 minutes inside the zone had felt subjectively like longer, and that at one point she had become briefly disoriented in a way that had no navigational justification. The zone was a simple open shape in flat ground. She had entered from the south edge and could see the north edge the entire time. She said that when she looked up to orient herself, there was a period of approximately 4 seconds during which she had no sense of which direction was north. Then it resolved and she walked out, and it did not happen again. I pulled out the working topo and looked at both features again. Dario's stand, Reyes's dieback. I looked at the camp. All 3 points were on a rough line imperfectly, but the alignment was close enough to notice. I said that out loud. Dario studied the map and agreed the alignment was approximate. Reyes said correctly that 3 points and a containing location were not a statistical pattern, they were a line, which any 3 points formed, and the camp's position near that line was not meaningful with a sample size of 2 anomalies. I agreed with that analysis. I also noticed that she had suggested, without quite saying so, that the camp was not simply near the line, but between the 2 features, which placed it inside whatever spatial relationship those features had. Nobody said that explicitly, We talked about the approaching weather and the week's remaining sample targets and went to sleep. I slept badly for the first time. I lay in my sleeping bag and worked through the standard explanations, permafrost dynamics for the tree lean, soil chemistry or drainage history for the dieback, visual artifact for the light quality Dario described, inner ear for Reyes's momentary disorientation, and none of them satisfied me in the specific way that professional explanations were supposed to satisfy me by resolving the thing into something cataloged and closed. They were plausible. They were not sufficient. The distinction between plausible and sufficient was something I felt in my chest, rather than thought in my head, and I did not sleep well. Day 19. Reyes found a third feature. Her northernmost transects took her into country. We hadn't worked yet. Open mixed forest of white spruce and paper birch on elevated ground with longer sight lines and easier movement than the wet black spruce country to the south. She'd been covering good ground all morning, moving efficiently through the kind of terrain that rewarded the attention she gave it. And then she crested a low ridge and found herself looking down into a basin. Every tree in the basin was dead, standing dead, no bark, gray weathered wood, branches reduced to stubs. Not recently dead. The trees had been dead for years, she estimated, possibly longer. In interior Alaska, freeze-thaw cycling and frost heaving pulled standing deadwood down within a few years under normal conditions. These trees were still vertical, all of them, which was already wrong in a way that had no immediate explanation, but the ground between them was what stopped her. She said it was smooth in a way that ground in that landscape was never smooth, not eroded, not compacted by runoff or animal traffic, not explained by any natural process she could name. Uniformly, quietly flat, and empty of animal sign. No tracks, no scat, no cached food, no feathers or bones. A healthy interior boreal landscape was everywhere covered in the evidence of animal passage, the continuous record of things moving through and feeding and surviving. Inside the basin there was nothing. She circled the full rim without going down, took photographs from the edge, and continued her transects without entering. That evening I mapped all three features: the leaning spruce stand, the dieback zone, the dead basin. I looked at their positions relative to each other and relative to the camp for a long time. The three features did not form a perfect line. They formed a rough triangle, irregular, no two sides equal. The camp sat approximately inside that triangle. I showed the map to Dario and Reyes. Reyes made the same statistical argument she had made before, and it was still technically correct. And this time none of us leaned on it the way we had before. We agreed to include all three features in that evening's check-in with the Fairbanks office. Griffin, the project manager, listened carefully and asked whether any of it affected sample collection or crew safety. I said sample collection was not affected and that I had no specific safety concern, meaning nothing was exhibiting predatory or threatening behavior. He said to keep everything in the site log and carry on. He was not dismissive. He simply had no framework in which three anomalous terrain features in a remote survey block constituted an operational problem. That night was the clearest night of the assignment. I watched the aurora for a long time from outside my sleeping tent, the cold working through my jacket layers methodically, the way cold did when you stood still in it, and I thought about the triangle on the map. I thought about magnetic field effects on root system development. I thought about the possibility that there was a subsurface feature, a large buried mass of different mineralogy, a zone of chemical contamination from old industrial activity, anything that could affect vegetation and soil chemistry at surface level over the distances involved. I pulled up Dario's magnetometer data for the areas nearest the three features and looked at it for 30 minutes. There was nothing. The subsurface magnetic signature of our entire survey block was among the least anomalous I had worked in professionally. I went to sleep eventually. The aurora was still running when I did. I am going to skip day 20, which was spent in camp during weather that kept us grounded for most of the day, And note only that all three of us slept poorly that night, and that none of us knew the others had until we compared notes much later. There was something in the weather that day, not in the storm itself, which was ordinary, but in the quality of the silence between gusts, the way the pauses felt occupied rather than empty. I wrote that in my personal log and immediately questioned whether I was doing the thing I had specifically cautioned myself against doing, which was loading the environment with meaning it hadn't earned. I left the notation in. Day 21 was the day we found the first track. I was working the eastern boundary of the survey grid, running transects along elevated ground where the mixed forest gave way to open birch on better drained soil. Around 11 in the morning, I came down off a low benchland into a willow drainage, a narrow, wet corridor, maybe 8 meters across. The ground around the stream margin soft and dark and cold. The willows overhead thin and leafless already, their stripped branches making a gray lattice against the sky. I was crossing at a narrow point, stepping carefully on the rocks in the stream bed, and I saw it on the far bank in the mud of the stream margin before I had fully crossed. A single impression. One, the mud on that bank was soft enough and dark enough to hold detail clearly, and the detail was clear. It was large. I placed my boot beside it before I did anything else, and the impression was approximately 3 times the length of my size 9 boot and considerably wider, but the profile was wrong for any enlarged version of anything I could name. It was wrong for bear in several distinct ways. Wrong depth distribution, wrong shape at the leading edge, wrong ratio of length to width. It was wrong for moose in ways equally specific. It was not a human track. The depth was significantly greater than my own boot print in the same mud, implying a mass substantially greater than my own, but the edges of the impression were clean. No lateral displacement of the mud outward from the edges, no secondary ridging, none of the deformation signatures that accompanied mass consistent movement through soft ground. It looked less like something had stepped into the mud and more like something had stood there. Still, weight fully committed, no motion. There was nothing else. No second impression, no continuation of whatever track sequence would have included this one. No approach evidence on the bank above the stream margin, no compression in the taller grass at the top of the bank, no broken willow stems, no soil disturbance in the drier ground above the mud zone where something of that implied mass would have left some mark descending toward the water. I checked the stream bed in both directions for 20 meters. Nothing moved in it. The water was 6 inches deep and clear over gravel, and there was nothing in it. I photographed the impression 17 times. I measured it with my field tape. 61 centimeters long, 44 centimeters at the widest point, with a maximum depth of 4 centimeters in the soft mud at what I estimated to be the center of mass. I photographed it again with my boot for scale. I examined every willow stem within 5 meters for sign of contact. I looked at the opposite bank for a continuation. I stood in the stream bed in the cold water and looked at the impression from directly above it and from both sides for a long time. Then I walked back to camp and told Dario and Reyes what I'd found. Reyes asked the same questions I had already asked and answered for myself, and we went through them methodically, one by one, because that was how both of us approached problems, and neither of us saw any reason to change the approach now. She looked at the photographs on my camera for a long time, cycling through them several times, going back to the scale photo with my boot in frame. Dario was very quiet and very still, which was the way he looked when he was processing toward a conclusion. He wasn't ready to speak yet. At the end of it, Reyes said she couldn't identify the impression from the photographs and wanted to see it in person. I said I'd take her there the next morning. That evening, I ran the satellite check-in early and told Griffin about the track. He asked the bear question. I said it was not consistent with bear morphology in any specific way I could define, that I was familiar with black bear and brown bear tracks, and this was neither. He said he had a wildlife biologist contact he could reach and would call us the next day. He did. The biologist asked careful, methodical questions about dimension, depth, edge morphology, and the absence of any secondary impression or approach trail, and he was thorough in a way that told me he was taking it seriously. At the end of the call, he said he'd like to see the photographs when we were back in Fairbanks, and that pending that review, he had no identification to offer. 19 years of wildlife work in the interior, no identification. The following 3 days were the most sustained discomfort of my professional life, and I say that carefully, meaning not fear exactly, not acute threat response, but something longer and lower and more pervasive, a kind of environmental hypervigilance, an inability to stop paying a quality of attention I didn't know how to turn off. We continued our work because the grid had to be completed, and we were trained people, and we completed it day by day, collecting good data in a landscape that was behaving more or less normally in every way that could be measured. Dario went back to the leaning spruce stand. He went inside this time. He ran his transect lines, operated his instrument, recorded his data. The light was still wrong inside, he said, but it hadn't stopped him the way it had the first time. The convergence of the lean, in his judgment, was more pronounced than his initial observation. He was careful to separate what his instrument measured, nothing anomalous, from what he perceived with his own senses, which was a tightening, a concentration, a sense that the space inside the stand was under more pressure than the space outside it. Those were his words. Under more pressure. Reyes descended into the dead basin. She spent 20 minutes on the floor of it, taking soil cores and making observations. The ground was as flat as she described, from the rim flat, in a way that she said repeatedly she had no geological process to explain, given that natural ground in the interior accumulated irregularity over time through frost action and drainage and root movement, and this ground had none of it. The soil cores were unremarkable. The silence inside the basin was different from the silence outside it, in a way she found difficult to specify. She said it was the silence of a space that was deliberately quiet rather than incidentally quiet, though she acknowledged that was not a meaningful scientific distinction. She said she'd had to actively resist the impulse to move quietly while she was down there, as if noise would constitute a breach of something. I ran transects between the 3 anomalous features in the open ground that connected them. The second afternoon, in late light, I watched ground fog in a low area between 2 alder stands drift in a direction inconsistent with the wind. The wind was moving southeast. The fog was moving north. I watched it for 4 minutes and logged it without interpretation. Day 26, 6:40 in the morning. Dario came into the cook tent where I was starting the stove and said, with the factual calm of someone delivering information he had decided to deliver without inflection, "There's a track next to the truck." We walked out together. The night had been the coldest yet, cold enough to lay a light frost on the grass of the clearing and on the metal surfaces of the camp equipment and on the dry ground around the truck. The frost held impressions the way wet mud held them, with good detail and reasonable permanence until the temperature rose above freezing. The truck was parked at the eastern edge of the clearing, nose toward the utility track, in the position it had occupied for 26 days. On the driver's side, close against the body of the truck, close enough that whatever had made the impression would have been standing with its mass inches from the vehicle's door. There was a single impression in the frosted ground. One, the same general profile I had photographed in the stream drainage 10 days earlier. The same clean edges, the same absence of approach evidence, the same uniform depth and absence of lateral displacement. It had stood there, beside the truck, in the night, while the 3 of us were sleeping in our separate tents 30 meters away. Reyes came out and looked without speaking. The frost was already beginning to sublimate as the morning temperature climbed, and we worked quickly. Dario shot it from every angle. Reyes measured it with the field tape. I photographed the surrounding ground for a 10-meter radius in every direction, looking for any additional evidence of presence. The measurement, 63 centimeters long, 46 centimeters wide, within the range of measurement variation from the drainage impression 10 days before. Same maker, same behavior standing still, weight fully committed, no motion. We stood in the clearing in the early light of an Alaska morning in late September, the three of us, in the specific silence that followed the end of the working portion of our assessment of what we were looking at. A silence that was not absence, but arrival. The moment after a long argument in which both sides have finally said the true thing, and there is nothing left to dispute, and the truth sits there between you, not comfortable, not going away. I want to try to say precisely what that felt like. I have tried many times since, and I will try again now, because I think the precision matters. There is a version of that moment that would be fear, elevated heart rate, adrenaline, the mobilization of the survival system. I did not feel that. What I felt was something I can only describe as contextual revision, a sudden, complete understanding that I had been operating inside a set of assumptions about the location I was in and the nature of what that location contained, and that those assumptions were no longer accurate, and that the revision was total and could not be partially accepted. You couldn't acknowledge the track beside the truck and continue to believe that the landscape around you was the landscape you had understood it to be when you arrived. The revision was complete, and it was irreversible, and I did not have a professional framework, or any other kind of framework, for what the revised version implied. Reyes said, without raising her voice, "We should break camp." Dario and I agreed without discussion. I contacted Griffin on the satellite communicator and told him we were discontinuing field operations for safety reasons. He asked me to be specific. I was specific. He did not argue. He told us to document everything thoroughly and come in. We broke camp in 4 hours, which was faster than our standard breakdown time, but not so fast that we were sloppy. We packed correctly, secured all equipment for transport, retained every sample we had collected. The work of breaking camp was the most useful thing any of us did that morning. It gave us a task that matched our training and kept the hands and the professional mind occupied, while the rest of us did whatever it was doing. We loaded the truck and drove the utility track toward the maintained road. I drove. Dario rode in the front passenger seat. Reyes sat in the back seat among the equipment cases and her pack. The birches on both sides of the track had gone almost fully yellow, that hard metallic yellow of the interior autumn, and the morning light was low and oblique through them, long shadows lying across the track ahead of us in parallel bars. The track was in reasonable condition, and I drove it at the speed it warranted, which required full attention. I am going to be careful about what I say happened on the drive out. I have been over it many times, and I want to be accurate and not elaborated. At approximately 8 miles from camp, on a section of the track that ran through a narrow corridor of black spruce, the trees on the north side of the track were leaning toward the track. The lean was not extreme. If I had not spent 11 days observing and thinking about subtle lean patterns in that landscape, I might not have consciously registered it. But I had spent 11 days doing exactly that, and I registered it. The trees on the north side of the track were leaning in from above, toward the track, in the same inward convergence pattern Dario had documented and described. I did not say anything. I drove. 3 miles further, in open ground where the track crossed a sedge flat, the fog lying in the low ground to the left of the track was moving, slowly, without apparent source, moving toward the track. The wind in the upper air was moving the birch crowns away from us visibly in the opposite direction. The fog was moving toward us, organized in a slow, continuous drift that had no meteorological cause I could name. I drove through it. It took about 40 seconds to clear. In those 40 seconds, the visibility was reduced enough that I drove by feel as much as sight. I did not say anything. 1 mile from the maintained road, in a final section of mixed forest where the track narrowed between spruce on both sides, the trees nearest the track on both sides were still, completely still. The upper canopy was moving in a wind that I could feel through the truck's slight buffeting on the exposed stretches. The trees immediately flanking the track, for a stretch of perhaps 100 meters, were not moving. Their branches hung. Their crowns did not sway. The stillness was the same quality as what I had seen at the camp tree line on day 17, which I had logged as a wind shadow anomaly and not mentioned to the others. I drove through the still section and came out the other side and onto the maintained road and accelerated. Dario said quietly, looking straight ahead through the windshield at the paved surface of the road. It was watching us leave. Nobody responded. There was nothing to respond with. He had articulated something that all three of us had been carrying in our bodies for the previous 40 minutes, and possibly for longer than that, and the articulation was accurate, and the accuracy was the worst part of it, not because what he described was terrifying in any acute way, but because it was true, and we all knew it was true, and knowing it was true meant accepting a version of that landscape and of what occupied it that we did not have any intellectual or professional container for. We drove to Fairbanks without stopping. We debriefed with Griffin and submitted the full documentation, site logs, field notes, all photographs, the sample inventory, the measurement records for both impressions. The wildlife biologist reviewed the photographs in person 2 days later and spent an hour going through them with Dario and me. He said what he had said on the phone. No identification. He said he would like to think about it further. As far as I know, he is still thinking about it. I have thought, at considerable length and on more nights than I can accurately count, about the meaning of the impression beside the truck. Of all the things that happened in that survey block across 26 days, it is the one I return to most reliably. Not the leaning trees, not the dead basin, not the fog moving against the wind, not even the first track in the stream drainage. The one beside the truck, because it was not in the landscape. It was in the camp. It was beside the place I slept. It was made in the night, while I was in my sleeping bag 3 tent lengths away. And it made no sound I heard. And in the morning, the only evidence it had ever been there was a single clean impression in the frost, already beginning to sublimate as the temperature rose. I keep thinking about the precision of it, not that something had come close to us, which was alarming enough, but that it had come to a specific location beside the truck, the driver's side, the door, and had stood there without movement and without contact, and had left one mark, and had left. Whatever process that was, it was not random. It chose a position. It chose stillness. It chose, as far as the evidence allowed me to conclude anything, to be near us without disturbing us. That choice, if it was a choice, if a thing like that made choices in any sense I understood, implied something about the nature of its attention that I could not interpret and could not stop trying to. The ethnogeographer colleague who connected me with the Yupik elder I spoke with afterward had been careful to prepare me for the possibility that the elder might not want to talk about it at all, that the appropriate response in some traditional frameworks was not to discuss certain things, but simply to move away from them and say nothing. So I was not prepared for how willing he was to listen, and how precisely he listened, and how long he thought before he said anything. He asked me to describe the features in order. I did. He asked about the track, specifically the dimensions, the single impression, the positioning beside the vehicle. I told him. He asked whether we had been harmed. I said we had not. He was quiet for a moment and then said that some places in that region had always been occupied by things that had no human-scale relationship to time or territory, that predated the landscape in a way that made the word ancient insufficient, and that the appropriate relationship with such presences was not investigation or documentation, but recognition and departure. He said we had done the right thing by leaving. He said the track beside the vehicle was not threat behavior and not territorial marking in any sense those terms applied to animals. He paused again, for long enough that I thought he might not continue. Then he said, "It was checking on you. I have held that sentence for 2 years. I have not found a way to put it down. I have not found a way to interpret it that I can comfortably live with, or a way to dismiss it that feels intellectually honest. It was checking on you." The word checking carries so much ordinary weight. The checking of a parent on a sleeping child, the checking of a doctor on a patient, the checking of a neighbor after a storm. It implies a kind of sustained attention across time, an awareness of the thing being checked sufficient to notice a change in its state. It implies that whatever stood beside the truck in the night while we slept had been paying enough attention to us for long enough to have a reason to come to where we were and confirm our condition. I do not know what to do with that. I do not know if there is anything to do with it. I still work in interior Alaska. I have not returned to that survey block, and I have declined the 2 projects since that would have taken me near it. Dario has left fieldwork entirely and does laboratory-based analysis from an office in Anchorage. He seems well. We don't talk about it when we talk, which is occasionally. Reyes continues to work in the field, as far as I know, and has said nothing about it publicly and nothing to me privately beyond our initial debriefs, which I respect completely. It is her experience to manage however she manages it. The photographs are in a folder on my work laptop and a backup drive at home. I look at them sometimes. The scale photograph from the drainage, my boot beside the impression in the dark mud, the photos from the clearing, the impression in the frost with the truck door behind it, the gap between the outer edge of the impression and the lower door panel measuring, in the best of the photographs, maybe 8 inches. I look at the clean edges and I think about the arithmetic of the depth and the implied mass, and I think about the fact that whatever carried that mass was standing 8 inches from a door I would have opened if I had woken up that night and needed air. It was there. I was there. It came close enough to leave a mark in the frost beside where I was sleeping, and it left one mark, and it left, which means, and this is the part I keep coming back to in the final way, that on every previous night, on all 25 nights before that last morning, the frost, where it lay and was cold enough to hold an impression, may have held an impression I never looked for because I didn't know to look. 25 nights in that landscape, inside that triangle of features, with the thing that organized the trees and quieted the basin and moved the fog against the wind. 25 nights of it checking on us, if that was what it was doing, in the frost or the mud or the soft ground at the edge of the clearing. And the only reason I know it was there at all is that on the last morning we looked, the ground in that drainage is freezing again. It is late September as I write this, and the frost will be on the clearing by morning, and on the mud at the stream margins, and on the flat ground around whatever is camped in that part of the interior right now, whoever they are, and whatever they drove in on that deteriorating utility track. I don't know if it's still there. I don't know if it moves or if it stays. I don't know if the triangle of features is still a triangle or whether it has expanded, whether the leaning spruce stand has tightened its convergence further in the 2 years since we left, whether the dead basin has grown or the dieback zone has spread. I don't know, and I have decided to accept not knowing, because the alternative is going back. And I am not going back. But I think about whoever's out there. I think about whether they notice the lean in the trees on the north side of whatever track takes them in, and whether the fog they see in the low ground is moving the right direction, and whether, on a cold, clear night when the frost lays down well, they go out to their truck in the morning and look at the ground beside the driver's door before they do anything else. The impression was 63 centimeters long, 46 wide, clean edges, uniform depth. 1. I'm grateful we were asleep when it came. I'm less sure, with time, about whether that gratitude makes sense.